Coffee for most people is less of a hobby and more of a practical way of staying awake and being more productive. And I myself was one of those people for a long time. I was a Keurig person. I wanted the quickest and easiest cup of coffee that I could just dump some cream and sugar into and not really taste the coffee so much. And that's perfectly fine if you're one of those people. But if you've ever wondered what a good cup of coffee tastes like or how you might be able to make one at home, coffee as a hobby can be really rewarding. Not only will you enjoy your coffee more, but the process of making coffee is an art form in itself. All the little variables that go into making a cup of coffee become your daily experiment where you tweak and adjust things a little bit until you find your sweet spot. And on top of that, you can start to develop your palate so that you can pick out more subtleties in your coffee and even tell differences between them. And the cool thing about getting into coffee as a hobby is that you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of equipment all at once. You can start small in whatever your coffee setup is. You can make small incremental changes that are both easy and relatively cheap to start heading in the direction of a better cup of coffee. So in this video, I'm going to share how to get started with coffee as a hobby, and I'm going to share some tips about my journey with coffee along the way. So the first thing to consider, and the easiest thing to do if you already have some sort of way to make coffee already, is just to buy better coffee. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. I think one of the best ways is to support your local coffee roaster. Shout out to Red Rooster and Floyd. That's where I get a lot of my coffee. But if you don't have a local coffee roaster, find somewhere reputable online that will ship to you. So a couple of things you want to consider is that, number one, you want the coffee to be pretty fresh. So this one, I believe, is roasted January the 4th, so that's like no more than a week ago. Coffee is definitely best when it's fresh. So that's the first consideration. The next one, if you have some way to grind your coffee, the best way to get it is whole bean instead of pre-ground. So you'll see it looks sort of like this, just a bunch of beans here. And the reason for that is when you grind the beans yourself right before you brew the coffee, it just tastes a whole lot better. I'm sure there are more scientific reasons, but that's really the gist of it. So step number one, buy better coffee. So as mentioned previously, it's really ideal if you can buy whole beans instead of pre-ground coffee and grind the beans yourself right before you actually make the coffee. So here I have a few different kinds of grinders. I'm just going to go through some of those. So this was my first grinder, and actually this isn't really made for coffee. If you look in here, it's actually got a blade in it, which isn't the best for grinding coffee. It actually produces like a really fine dust and a really uneven grind. Plus you have no control over like the size of the grind with this one. So the coffee that you grind in this one is not going to be very good, and I just wouldn't recommend it at all. I just wanted to call that out. The second one here is a hand burr grinder. And burr grinders are really ideal for grinding coffee. Now this is one that I've been using for a few years, and it works pretty well. It's relatively cheap. You can get one of these for like 12 bucks on Amazon or something like that. And it's pretty effective. I do find that the grind on this is a little bit uneven. So you get some pebbles that are just differing in size that makes for, it's harder to make a consistent cup of coffee. You can adjust the grind size on this one. But this one is great to have around just in general, even if you have a better one. Just because you can actually take this with you like camping It's really easy to travel with if you're visiting relatives or whatever. So this one is just a good one to have, and it's a really great starting point. Now this third one is one that I just got recently. This is a fully electric burr grinder, so it does the same as this manual one, but it does it all automatically. You put the beans in this hopper up here, and then you have control over what the grind size is, which is really important because that's something that you want to tweak based on your preferences and what kind of apparatus that you use to actually make your coffee and so on. But this is probably what you want eventually. It's quite a bit more expensive than the hand grinder here, but it's well worth it if you can afford one. So the next thing I want to talk about is the apparatus that you actually use to make the coffee. So this is going to be an upgrade from your like standard drip coffee maker or your Keurig. The first one I want to talk about is one that I don't actually have here because I got rid of it a long time ago. But one of the most popular starting places for a budding coffee hobbyist is a French press. And a French press is pretty easy to use. You really just put the coffee in, the water in, let it steep, and then strain it and pour it into a cup. And it's pretty straightforward, not really a lot you can mess up. In my opinion, it's a really good starter option, but for me, it was kind of a pain to clean every day. And on top of that, your coffee can be a little gritty because some of the grounds can actually seep through the filter. So, but another one of the great upsides though, which isn't the case for all of these, is that you can make more than one cup of coffee at a time. So if that's important to you and you want like a really easy, straightforward option that still is going to make a really good cup of coffee, then a French press is the way to go. The second option I want to talk about here is this one here. So these 4 items are all the same thing. It's called an AeroPress. This is one that I've used for a really long time. It's maybe not quite as straightforward as the French press, but in my opinion, it's not at all difficult to use, and you'll get probably the most consistent cup of coffee from the AeroPress. And if you do it correctly, which is pretty easy to do, you'll probably never get any grit or any grounds in your coffee, which is really nice. The other great thing about the AeroPress is that it's relatively easy to travel with. It comes with a little zipper pouch that you can put all of these things in, along with the hand grinder that I showed. So you can carry one little bag and be ready to brew a really good cup of coffee, whether you're camping or traveling somewhere to your relatives or whatever. So I think the AeroPress is probably the best starter option out of the 3. But the biggest knock on it is that you can only make pretty much 1 cup of coffee at a time. I'm pretty sure they only make one size, and it's really only big enough for 1 cup. So if you're making for more than 1 person at a time, you probably want to go with either a French press or the next option. So the last one I want to talk about is called a pour over. And similar to the AeroPress, this goes on top of a cup or some kind of container. The biggest benefit of this is that you get the most control out of all the options. You really control all the variables, like the amount of coffee you put in, the amount of water that you pour through it, the sort of direction that you pour, like everything matters with this one. And I guess the drawback is that it can be a little bit punishing, unlike the AeroPress, which is going to give you a pretty consistent cup of coffee every time. This one, you have to really have your technique down. But that said, I don't think any of these are difficult to use, this one included, so don't be intimidated. This one is the simplest and it gives you the most control, so I think it's a real winner. One thing I'll say though is that you really want to have a kettle that with good pour control, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So the next thing I want to talk about is a kettle, which is one of the more important things in your coffee setup. So with a kettle, really all you need is something to heat up water, and you need to be able to pour it in like a relatively controlled fashion. Especially when you use a pour over, you're going to need something pretty precise. The one I have here is a gooseneck kettle. You see it has this neck right here, which is long. That just allows like a really controlled pour, which is really essential for the pour over. Not as important for the other two, but still nice to have. The other key thing that you might want eventually is a temperature control. So with this one, I have this little knob here where I can control the temperature. I usually do about 200 degrees, but that's up to personal preference. If you don't have a kettle with temperature control, there are other ways around that. You can do anything from just boiling some water and letting it sit for a little while until it cools down. You can also use like a thermometer and put it in the water and then turn it off whenever it comes up to temperature, which is actually something that I've done for years. But if you can afford it, having an actual temperature control on the kettle saves a whole lot of time and frustration, so I'd highly recommend it. So those are some of the elements of making coffee as a hobby. And like I said, you don't have to go out and buy all of these things at once. Really the best place to start if you have some way of making coffee is buy a really good bag of whole bean coffee and a little hand grinder or something like that, and just start grinding your own fresh coffee, and that's going to improve things a lot. Then you can go from there and add more things incrementally as you can afford it. So I'm thinking just kind of like a over the top video while I kind of pour over. I'll kind of maneuver so that you can get over it.
You don't want me to do anything like
Actually,